The tension between the US and the Soviet Union was near its peak in 1961 regarding the space race. Both nations were hurrying to send the first person to space. The Soviets didn't really know the exact schedule of when the US was going to send an American to space, but they really wanted to be the first ones, and that may have resulted in them taking on a bit more risk than appropriate. There were several technical bugs during the last two Soviet space flights with dogs, and they didn't really fix all of the problems but okayed the flight to take off with a human inside it, the human being Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet. And the day before the takeoff, they realized that the weight of the rocket was above what the safe max weight limit was. So they removed all of the components overnight and in the process damaged two gauges that would measure temperature and pressure. There was also a problem with the hatch of the spacecraft. When they placed Yuri inside his module and tried to close the hatch didn't seal properly. So they spent an hour trying to remove all the screws to see what the problem was, while Yuri was strapped into a seat and ready to go, and then they tried to close the hatch. Nevertheless, the hatch was sealed and the spacecraft lifted off. The plan for Yuri was to only orbit the Earth once and then re-enter Earth. The flight was only supposed to take a few hours to complete, but the spacecraft was equipped with food and water for 10 days in case the engine of the spacecraft failed during the orbit and the astronaut has to wait for the spacecraft to eventually fall towards Earth, as the atmosphere particles would hit the spacecraft and slow it down enough to make the spacecraft exit its orbit and fall towards Earth. But these supplies were not needed. The effects of zero gravity on the human body were not known at the time, and they thought it may hinder a pilot's ability to fly, and some actually thought that the pilot might actually go crazy in space. And so the spacecraft was entirely controlled by the people on the ground. The astronaut didn't really have anything to do. But in case of an emergency, if the ground loses control of the spacecraft, then it was decided that the astronaut would be given codes which would allow him to take control of the spacecraft. But the man in charge of the mission broke the rule and gave the codes to Yuri anyways before the flight, but of course they were not needed. During the flight, communication was lost several times. The spacecraft consisted of two sections during re-entry. One section that contained the astronaut, and this section was made for re-entry, so it could endure the intense heat during re-entry, but the other section was planned to detach during re-entry. But when the sections detached, some wires got entangled and held the two sections together. This caused the two sections to start spinning or gyrating really fast, but luckily after some time the wires snapped and the two sections detached completely, and the re-entry section, the one that contained the astronaut, came into the correct re-entry position. Yuri experienced 8 Gs during re-entry but stayed conscious. The plan was for Yuri to eject from the spacecraft and parachute to the ground, as he did, while the spacecraft smashed into the ground at an incredible speed. And so Yuri orbited the Earth once, and the flight lasted 108 minutes. And according to the International Federation for a Spacecraft, for a flight to be considered a space flight, the astronaut had to land with the spacecraft. In other words, when the spacecraft hits the ground, the astronaut needs to be inside it. But as planned, Yuri ejected his parachute about 7 kilometers from the ground, and so he did not land with his spacecraft. But the Soviet Union did not tell this to the Federation. The Soviets said that Yuri landed with his spacecraft, and the Federation deemed the spaceflight as meeting the guidelines and counted it as a proper spaceflight. And after a few months later, during another Russian spaceflight, the Russian astronaut revealed that he had ejected from his spacecraft, and then it was known that the Russians didn't really know how to land the spacecraft with the pilot, and so the spacecraft had no feature at all that would make it possible for the astronaut to land inside his spacecraft. Once the truth was revealed to the Federation then actually changed the rule, stating that the great technological achievement in a space flight was the ability to get into orbit and safely re-enter Earth's atmosphere and return the astronaut safely on Earth. The new rule did not mention that the astronaut had to land inside his spacecraft, and so Yuri's record as the first man in space was intact. But let's say, even if his record was deemed unacceptable, it doesn't take away from the fact that Yuri was the first person to enter space and orbit around the Earth. After his space flight, he was a very known figure, and so the Soviet Union didn't want to take the chance of him dying in a future flight. And so therefore, after his first flight, he never actually went to space again and just worked with and taught new astronauts. And it was just within a month that the Americans would send the first American man to space. Thanks for watching and take care.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.